I never imagined that an ordinary evening would change everything. For years, I had worked under my boss with loyalty, trying to keep my head down and do my job well. His family was familiar to me, his wife with her polite smiles, and his son who often dropped by the office, leaning against the reception desk with casual charm. The son was younger than me, yet he carried himself with a kind of easy confidence that always made people look twice. I tried not to look too long, but I always did. His voice lingered in my mind after he left, the way his laughter filled the room, and the playful way his eyes sometimes caught mine. It was dangerous to even entertain such thoughts. He was my boss's son, the one person I should have kept at a safe distance. And yet, whenever he appeared, I felt something shift inside me, something reckless and unspoken. That evening, my boss was away on a sudden business trip. His son had been at the office longer than usual, pacing around restless. "Can you drop me home?" he asked casually, his tone light, but his eyes watching me carefully. It wasn't a big request. I had driven him before. Still, I felt a strange flutter in my chest. But when we reached his house, he hesitated at the gate. "I don't feel like being here tonight," he said, almost under his breath. "It's too quiet, too empty. Can I come over to your place instead?" The request caught me off guard. My mind screamed at me to say no, to remind him that it was inappropriate, that people would talk, that my boss would never forgive me. But my lips betrayed me. "Sure," I heard myself say. The ride to my home felt longer than usual. The silence between us was thick, charged, yet neither of us spoke about what was truly on our minds. His fingers tapped against the window, restless, while my grip on the steering wheel tightened. Every mile closer to my house felt like crossing a boundary I could never uncross. When we finally arrived, he followed me inside without hesitation. My house was modest compared to his family's mansion, yet he seemed strangely at ease, wandering into the living room, running his fingers along the bookshelf, asking questions about little things he noticed. I stood there, unsure of what to do, my heart pounding in my chest. "Do you live here alone?" he asked, his voice echoing softly. "Yes," I replied, and that single word carried more weight than I intended. Alone. That's what I had been for so long. Perhaps that was why the air between us felt so different now. Two lonely people standing in the same space, both pretending they didn't notice how close they were. We sat together in my small living room, talking about nothing at first, his classes, his father's strictness, the boredom of routine. But slowly, the conversation slipped into more personal waters. He admitted he sometimes felt suffocated by the expectations placed on him, how he longed for freedom, for someone who saw him beyond his last name. And in that moment, his gaze locked onto mine, steady and unflinching. It wasn't just curiosity in his eyes. It was something deeper, something I recognized, but had never dared to acknowledge. My chest tightened, heat rising in my skin. I knew I should have looked away, cracked a joke, broken the moment before it became dangerous. But I didn't. Instead, I let the silence linger. He smiled faintly, almost as if he could hear the conflict raging inside me. "It feels different here," he murmured, "like I can just be myself." The weight of those words pressed against me. I knew what he meant, and I knew what it might lead to. I should have ended it there, sent him home, reminded myself of the lines that should never be crossed. But the truth was, I didn't want him to leave. The night stretched on. We stayed in that room, talking until the clock on the wall ticked past midnight. The world outside faded, and it was just him and me, caught in a moment neither of us fully understood, yet neither wanted to escape. When I finally showed him to the spare room, he paused at the door, his hand resting on the frame. He turned, giving me one last glance that lingered far too long. A silent message passed between us, an unspoken invitation, a secret waiting to unfold. And in that moment, I knew this was only the beginning. I never imagined that an ordinary evening would change soft everything. And golden, For years,
spilling into the room
I had
where he
worked
slept.
under my boss with
I had
loyalty,
barely
trying to
slept
keep my
at
head
all.
down and
Every
do my
time
job
I closed
well.
my eyes,
His
I saw
family
his
was
face,
familiar to me.
the way he had looked
His
at me the
wife
night
with her
before,
polite smiles,
that quiet
and his son who
glance
often
that
dropped
spoke
by the
louder than
office,
words.
leaning against the
I told
reception
myself
desk
to
with
get
casual
up, to
charm.
make coffee,
The son was younger
to shake
than
this
me,
off as
yet
nothing
he
more
carried
than
himself
foolish
with a
temptation.
kind of easy
But
confidence
when I stepped
that
into the
always
hallway,
made people
I saw
look
him
twice.
standing there.
I tried not to look
barefoot,
too long,
hair
but
tousled,
I always
a sleepy
did.
smile
His
on his
voice
lips.
lingered
Something
in my
about the
mind
sight
after he left,
disarmed me
the way his laughter
completely.
filled the room.
He looked less
and
like
the playful
my
way
boss's
his son
eyes, and
sometimes
more like
caught
someone
mine.
who belonged.
It was
here
dangerous
in the space
to even
with me.
entertain
Didn't mean to
such
wake
thoughts.
you. He
I
was
said,
my voice
boss's
rough.
son, the
You
one
didn't, he
person
replied
I should have
softly.
kept at a safe
I don't think I
distance.
really slept.
And yet,
whenever he
sat
appeared
at the kitchen table,
I felt something
mugs
shift
of coffee
inside
between
me.
us,
Something
silence,
reckless
stretching,
and
and breaking
unspoken.
into fragments
That
of small
evening,
talk.
my boss was
beneath
away.
every
on a sudden
word
business
was the
trip.
same.
His son
unspoken
had
question.
been at the office
What are we
longer
doing?
than usual.
Neither of us
pacing
dared to
around
ask it
restless.
aloud.
Can you
By
drop
the
me home?
afternoon,
He asked
the walls of my
casually, his
house
tone
felt
light,
like they were
but
closing
his
in,
eyes watching
not
me carefully.
suffocating.
It wasn't
but sheltering,
a big request.
wrapping us in a
I had driven
strange
him
cocoon
before.
where time
Still,
seemed to slow.
I felt a
We
strange
played
flutter
music
in my chest.
quietly,
But
scrolled
when we reached his
aimlessly through my
house,
phone,
he hesitated
and
at the
drifted
gate.
into long
I don't feel like
conversations
being
about
here
things we
tonight,
had never
he
admitted
said,
to anyone else.
almost under
He
his
spoke
breath.
about the pressure
It's too
of carrying
quiet,
his father's
too
name,
empty.
the
Can I
weight
come over to
of
your
being
place
watched,
instead?
judged,
The request
expected
caught me
to
off
follow
guard.
a path
My
he hadn't
mind
chosen.
screamed at me to
And
say
then his
no,
voice dropped
to remind
lower,
him that
almost
it
a
was
whisper.
inappropriate.
I feel
that
like I
people
can
would
breathe
talk
here, that my
with
boss
you.
would never
Like
forgive
I don't
me.
have to pretend.
But my lips betrayed
His
me.
words pierced
Sure,
something inside
I heard
me.
myself say,
I wanted to tell
the ride
him
to
that
my
I felt
home
the
felt
same,
longer than
that
usual.
in his presence,
The silence
I wasn't
between us
just
was
an
thick,
employee,
charged,
invisible,
yet
and
neither of us
replaceable.
spoke about
I
what
was someone he
truly
saw
on our minds.
but fear held me
His
back.
fingers tapped
Fear
against the window
of what it would mean.
restless,
Fear
while
of
my
what it would
grip on the
cost.
steering wheel
That
tightened.
evening,
Every
the
mile
closeness
closer
between
to my
us
house
became
felt like
unbearable.
crossing a boundary
We sat on
I
the
could
couch,
never uncross.
watching some
When we
mindless
finally
show,
arrived,
our shoulders
he followed
brushing now
me
and
inside
then.
without
Every
hesitation.
accidental touch
My house was
felt
modest
like
compared
fire
to his
on my
family's
skin.
mansion.
At
one
Yet,
point,
he seemed
shifted
strangely
closer.
at ease,
So
wandering
close,
into
I
the
could
living
hear
room,
the uneven
running his
rhythm of
fingers
breathing.
along the bookshelf.
I turned to him,
asking questions
and the world
about
seemed
little
to
things he
pause.
noticed.
His
I
eyes
stood
searched
there,
mine,
unsure of
silently
what to do,
asking permission.
my heart pounding
I should
in
have
my
turned
chest.
away.
Do you
I
live
should
here
have
alone?
reminded him
He
who we
asked,
were,
his
what
voice
this could
echoing
ruin.
softly. But
Yes,
instead,
I replied,
let the silence
and that
answer
single
for me.
word
His
carried
hand
more weight
found
than I
mine.
intended.
Tentative
Alone.
at first.
That's what I
then
had been
steady,
for so long.
fingers
Perhaps
intertwining
that was
as
why
if
the
they
air
had
between us
always
felt
belonged
so
there.
different
My
now.
chest tightened.
Two
Not with fear this
lonely
time,
people standing
but
in
with
the same
something
space,
raw, both
something
pretending they didn't
terrifyingly
notice how
real.
close they were.
That night,
we sat
in the
together
quiet
in
of
my
my small
house.
living room,
We stopped talking
pretending.
about nothing at
We didn't
first.
need to
His
say
classes,
much. His
every
father's
touch,
strictness,
every
the
boredom
glance,
of routine
carried the weight
but
of words
slowly,
we were too afraid
the
to speak.
conversation
It
slipped
wasn't
into
loud
more
or
personal
reckless.
waters. It was
He
tender,
admitted he
unhurried,
sometimes felt
as though we were
suffocated
both
by the
afraid the moment
expectations
would
placed
vanish
on him,
if we moved
how
too
he
quickly.
longed for
The
freedom,
hours blurred
for someone
together.
who saw him beyond
The
his
outside
last
world
name.
faded
And in that
away.
moment, his gaze
It was just
locked
us
onto mine,
in that room,
steady and unflinching,
discovering each
It
other
wasn't
in
just
ways
curiosity,
that felt both
in his
inevitable and
eyes.
forbidden.
It was
Every
something
time his hand
deeper,
brushed mine,
something I
every time his
recognized,
head
but
rested
had
against
never
my
dared to
shoulder,
acknowledge.
I felt
My
the
chest
pull of
tightened,
something I had
heat
spent years
rising in my
denying
skin.
myself. I
And
knew
yet, I should have
beneath
looked
the
away,
sweetness
there
there
was
was
guilt.
joke. It
Broken
lingered
in
in
the
the
moment
corners
before
of
it
my
became
mind like a
dangerous.
shadow.
But I didn't.
I couldn't chase
Instead,
away. I let the
I was
silence
betraying
linger.
my boss,
He smiled
the man
faintly,
who trusted me.
almost
I was
as if
crossing
he
a
could hear
line
the
that could
conflict
never be
raging
uncrossed.
inside me. But
It
when I
feels
looked at him,
different here, he murmured,
the softness
like
in
I
his
can just be
eyes,
myself.
the vulnerability
The weight
he rarely
of those
showed,
words
I
pressed
couldn't make
against me.
myself stop. I knew what
The
he
first
meant,
day
and I knew what it
bled
might
into
lead
the
to.
The
The
sun
sun
rising
rising
and setting
sent him
as if
home,
time had lost
reminded
all
myself
meaning.
of the
We
lines
laughed
that should
over
never be
breakfast.
crossed. We napped
But the
in the
truth
afternoon.
was,
I didn't want
we
to
whispered
leave.
in the dark.
The night stretched
Every
on.
moment felt
We stayed in that
suspended,
room,
fragile,
talking
precious.
until the clock on the
second
wall
night,
ticked
as
past
we lay in
midnight.
silence,
The
he
world
whispered,
outside
"Do you regret
faded.
this?"
And it was
I
just
turned to
him
and me,
the question heavy
caught
in the
in a
air.
moment moment, neither of
My
us
throat
fully understood,
tightened,
but
I
yet
told the
neither
truth.
wanted to escape.
No,
When I
his
finally
smile
showed
in
him
the
dim
spare
light
room
was small,
He paused at the
almost
door,
sad,
his hand
but filled with
resting
relief.
on the frame.
Me
He
neither.
turned,
Giving
and
me
so,
one
for
last
those 2
glance
days
that lingered
the
far
world
too long,
outside
a
ceased
silent
to exist.
message passed
There were no
between
bosses,
us,
no
an
families,
unspoken
no
invitation,
rules,
a
only
secret
us
waiting to
hidden
unfold.
away. And
Holding
in
on
that
to something
moment,
that felt
I knew
fleeting, but
this was only the
unforgettable.
beginning.
We both knew it couldn't last. We both knew that reality would return the moment we stepped outside that door. But for now, in the secrecy of my room, we chose to forget. For 2 days, we belonged to each other. I never imagined
third
that
morning
an ordinary
arrived,
evening would
the
change
air
inside
everything
my house
for
felt
years.
spilling into the room.
I had
worked
curtains
under
still
my boss.
blocked
I
up
had
loyalty,
barely
trying to
slept
keep my
at
head
all.
down.
Every
My
time
job
I closed my
but
eyes,
something
I saw
family
his
face,
familiar to
the
the
way
spell
he
of
had
those
looked
2
at me
days
was
was
euphoric.
working. Smiles,
He
quiet
stirred the sun
sun
who
who
often
often
dropped
spoke
by the
blinking
office
against the
words.
dim light.
I told myself
was
to soft,
casual,
but to make
clouded
coffee.
with the
The
sun was
to shake this off.
I
Yet
watched
he carried
him
himself
silently,
kind of
memorizing
easy.
the
When
curve
I
of
stepped
his
into
jaw.
the
Always
hall,
made
I
people
saw
his
his
lips
lips
standing
pressed
there.
together. I tried not to look
lost
too
in
long.
hair,
But
towels
part
I
of me
always
wanted
did.
to
Smile
freeze
on his
time.
voice lingered
Something
in
about
my
the
mind
sight
after he
bubbled
left
disarmed
forever.
me.
The way his
Complete
laughter
deep
filled the
down,
room,
I knew
less
that
like
playful
my
outside
eyes
was
already
and
sometimes
more like
caught
someone
neither
who
of us.
belonged.
It was that
dangerous
much as
as
we
we
dressed.
entertained.
Didn't
The
mean
silence
thoughts.
wasn't
I
uncomfortable.
said my voice was
but
on.
it was
The
different.
one
He
person
waited
waited
with
with
the
knowledge.
I don't think I
of what
really
waited
slept.
beyond
Yet,
these walls.
whenever he
Sat
appeared,
at my kitchen
I felt something
mugged
shift
against
the
the
counter,
counter,
and for the first
something
time,
reckless
stretching
in
my house,
breaking into
he looked
fragments
restless.
restless.
My boss
Yet
was
moved
away.
every
Every
word
word
was
was
the
finally he
same.
spoke.
His son had
we
been
can't
at
tell
the
anyone.
office
What are we
longer
doing?
than usual.
Neither
Words
of
were
us
sharp,
dared to
dared
ask,
but
but his
aloud.
voice cracked.
Can you
by
drop
the
me home
afternoon.
at the edges?
He asked
The walls of my
casually.
house
Tone
felt
I said
like they were
quietly,
closing in.
my
Eyes
hands
watching
tight
me
around the
suffocating.
mug.
It wasn't
Felt
just
a
big
big
request.
wrapping us in a
I had
string
dreamed
inside,
before where
rubbing the back
time
of his neck.
slowed.
I felt a
It's
strange
not just my
music
father.
in my
It's
chest.
everything.
But
People
when we
wouldn't
reached his
understand
house,
my phone.
he'd
Hesitated
and
and
drifted
into
I don't feel like
conversations
being
about
here
things we
tonight.
had never
The ache
said
in
to
his
anyone
voice,
else.
almost
Cut
he
deep
spoke
than
about
I
the pressure
expected
of
of carrying
quiet. He
his
wasn't
father's
rejecting
empty.
me.
The
Can I
way
come over
really
to your
he
place
was
protecting
himself.
judged?
The
The
request
request
caught me
to follow
off
the
guard.
path. My
And
mind
yet,
screamed
the
at me,
reminder
and then his
of our
voice
reality
dropped to
lower,
remind him that
almost
I don't
whispered.
regret it.
Inappropriate.
I
feel like
my
I
voice
breathe
low, but
that
firm.
my boss would never
Like
let
I don't
my
have to
eyes
pretend.
fall to
My
my
lips
gaze
betrayed
for one
words
moment.
pierced
Sure,
something
there was
I heard
something
myself
fierce
say.
and
I wanted to
stare.
tell him
To
that
my
as though
home
he wanted
saying,
longer
etch
than
those
that in his
words
presence.
into
The
memory.
silence
I wasn't
between us
just
was
an
thick,
employee,
charged.
invisible.
But the truth neither of us
between
spoke about
I
what
was
was
friendly
friendly
or
or
not,
not.
but
Fear
the
held me
world's
back.
fingers
Outside the
fear
house
would
of
never
what it would
forgive
give
us.
us. Restless.
When it
Fear
was
of
finally
grip on the
steering wheel
that
tight,
evening,
we walked to the
every
door
mile
and
closer
the
to my
darkness
house.
became
My
felt
chest
like
crossing a
tightened with
boundary.
each
Sat on
every
the
step
couch
never
as
uncrossed.
watching
Each
some
footfall
mindless
was
finally
carrying him
arrive.
farther
Our
away from
shoulder
me.
followed
He
me
lingered
inside
at
without
the
every
threshold.
accidental.
His
My house
hand
was
felt like
resting
fire
against
on
the
my
frame,
skin, like it had
at
on the
one
first
point,
night.
he seemed
For a second, I thought he might turn
so
back,
wandering
close
into
the
the
door,
could hear
room,
the
uneven
running
rhythm
instead, he
of
gave
along
me a
the
small,
bookshelf.
I turned to him
Asking
and the
questions
world
about
thank you
the
for
pause.
these 2 days.
His
I
eyes
searched
swallowed
mine,
hard,
unsure of what
unable
to
to
ask
find the
him,
right
my heart
words.
pounding. I should have turned
I
away.
managed was
I should have reminded
then
him
he
was
was
gone.
His voice
The door
echoed
shut
softly
softly
behind
but
him.
yes,
Instead,
the sound of silence,
and
that's
through
the
the
house,
word
like
carrying
his hand
more weight
found
than
the
I
silence
intended.
that tended
Although
at
it was
first. That's what I had
unbearable
steady
for so long.
Everywhere
Perhaps
I
that was
looked,
why the
I
air
saw
between
him
us
always
felt
belonging.
so
Indentation
different
on
now.
my chest couch where he
Two
not with fear this
lonely
time,
people
empty
standing
mug
on
with
the
something
table.
raw,
Sheets
both
tangled
pretending they didn't
terrifyingly
notice how
real.
my home
That
nice
nice
place
sat
together
together
in
in
my
my small
house.
living room.
Now
He stopped
felt
talking
haunted
about
by
nothing
his
at
first.
first.
His
His
classes
for
for
hours.
every
Every
pastry room,
richness,
every
the
torn
bland
between
of
guilt
carried
and
the
longing.
weight
But
of words.
slowly,
I thought of my
the
boss,
conversations
he
he
placed
wasn't
me into
loud
more
or the
purpose.
betrayal I
It
now
was
carried
carried
like
like
a
a
sin.
sinner.
Sometimes
You
felt
couldn't
as though we were
wash
both
away.
I thought of
the
the
moment
moment
would
we
vanish.
vanished.
If
The
we
man,
moved
how
too
he had
long
walked out
for
my
the
door.
hours blurred
Someone who
together.
saw him beyond
The
his
outside
night,
world
I
faded
lay that
away.
moment, his gaze
Staring
just
lost
onto mine,
in that
sleep
room.
refused to come. Discovering
Every
each
time I
wasn't
closed
just
my eyes,
curiosity.
I
I felt his
hands
inevitable
mine
and
forbidden.
It was
Heard
every
voice
time his hand
whispering
brushed
in the
mine.
dark.
Something I
Every
memorized
time
his
his
head
head
but had
rested
never
against my
touched like
shoulder.
glass. I felt
My
the
chest
pull of
passing.
something I had
Spent
seen
years
rising
in
in
my
my
skin.
I carried myself.
I knew
and yet
as
I
though
should have
nothing
looked
had
away.
sweetness.
Cracked,
There was
but
guilt.
inside,
It
I
lingered
was
in the
unraveled
corners
before
of my
it became
mind
My
like
boss spoke to me,
shadow
but I didn't.
I couldn't
Instead,
discern,
I let
my
silence
was
betray my
completely
boss,
smile man
who
who
trusted
trusted
me.
me.
Almost
I was
crossing the line,
the
his son
never be
raging
inside me.
standing just
When I
across the
looked at
room.
him here, he
And
murmured
for a brief
softness,
second,
like
I can just
eyes,
be myself.
The
The world
vulnerability
around
we
us
rarely
kept
show.
those
Words pressed
but in
against
that
myself
single
stopped.
glance,
I knew what he
the
meant.
first
The
2
day,
days
I knew what it
led
might
into
have
the
shared
end.
returns.
The
I should have
sun
ended
rising
there
and
setting
setting
his
home.
time had
We
lost
reminded
all meaning.
myself
But
of
his
the
silence
lines
was
that chilly over
louder than
breakfast.
any
We
confession.
napped
But the
in the
truth was,
afternoon.
I knew this
I didn't
couldn't
want to
continue.
whispered in the dark.
I
I
knew
knew
we
we
every
every
moment
moment
felt
we
this
stayed in that
tethered
room,
to both
fragile,
joy,
talking until the
guilt
clock
on
on
the
the second
wall
night
as we lay in silence.
Even as the
days
days stretched into weeks,
and it was
I
just
turned to
held
him
on to the memory.
question heavy
Caught in a
air.
moment neither of my throat tight in a
lifetime.
I told the
neither
truth.
wanted to
Those
escape.
hours
When
behind
I
his
finally
doors
showed a
had
dim
shared
light,
was
every
small.
paused at the
Only
door,
had shown
his
me a
hand
part of
filled
myself
with
resting on
relief.
a frame.
Me neither.
A truth I could
given
give
me
so
one
for those
last
2 days.
they had given
the
me a
taste
taste,
of
a silent message passed. There were no bosses,
but
no
an
unspoken
unfamilies, no
invitation.
rules.
And though I
Only
carried
us
the weight of
hidden
silence,
away,
and
holding
in
on
that
to carrying
moment,
the
I
memory
knew
of him.
But
This was
under
only the
laughter,
beginning.
We both knew it couldn't last.
The look in his eyes when he
both
said
knew
he
that
didn't regret
reality
it.
would
It was
return the
both
moment
my
we stepped
burden
outside
and my
that door.
treasure. But
As
for
I
now,
stood in my
in
living
the secrecy
room
of my
one
room,
evening,
we chose
staring
to
at the
forget.
door where he
For
had once
2
paused,
days,
I
we
whispered
belonged
to
to
the
each
empty
other.
air. It was worth it. The house didn't answer, but in my heart I knew the truth. No matter what the world thought, no matter what guilt I carried, those 2 days were mine and his forever.